You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. Yesterday is Matt Bernstein. We're going to be asking the very important question, is all mental illness metabolic illness? Matt's an MD. He's the co-founder of Accord Metabolism for Mental Health. He's a highly respected clinical psychiatrist, a leading voice in metabolic psychiatry, which I've heard of functional psychiatry, but not metabolic, so it should be very interesting. He has 25 years of experience helping people achieve full mental health and functional recovery. So welcome, Matt.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah. How did your journey from, I would guess, you started out as a regular psychiatrist and then became what's called a metabolic one, or what's your background?
Yeah, that's right. I was a regular psychiatrist. I, trained at Mass General and McLean, these hospitals in Boston where, learned all the traditional medications and psychotherapies and other regular traditional psychiatric procedures. But over time, I really realized that I wasn't getting the outcomes with people with serious mental illness that they wanted and that I wanted with a lot of those traditional approaches. And about 8 years ago or so, I learned about this connection between metabolic health and brain health, originally through the illness of epilepsy, where they've been using ketogenic diets to improve metabolism and reduce epileptic seizures and symptoms for over 100 years. And I learned that this started to be applied in mental health as well. And I was incredibly intrigued by that because the science behind it's really compelling. And then I started doing it in practice and seeing amazing results with people that I had never seen with medications and other treatments that I knew how to provide. And I kept learning more and more and realized that, I really think this could be the future for our field.
Well, what does that mean, though? What is a metabolic psychiatrist? What do you do?
Yeah. So we're appreciating this connection between metabolic health and brain health and mental health, and really using levers that focus on improving metabolic health to improve someone's situation. So one of the main levers actually is the ketogenic diet, which is the most powerful way to improve metabolic health that we know, and very powerful for improving brain health. But in addition to that, we do synergistic things with that, like intensive exercise, if we can get people to do it. If we can't get intensive exercise, we'll take moderate exercise or even just walking to start until we get people moving more. But also things like working on their circadian rhythms, light exposure affects metabolism very strongly, and even things like mind-body practices are very powerful have very powerful effects on metabolism. And if we can combine all those things at once, we can sometimes take people who have what seems like a completely treatment-resistant serious mental illness, like treatment-resistant depression or bipolar disorder or even schizophrenia, and sometimes, vastly improve how they're doing.
Well, what does that mean, how they're doing? What kind of conditions do you deal with? People with bipolar or?
Yeah, exactly.
Give me some specifics here on what the person comes in with and what happens to them. What do you do?
Yeah, at Accord, we treat people with bipolar type 1 and type 2. We treat people with schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, treatment-resistant major depression, OCD. Sometimes people have comorbid PTSD. A lot of people have trouble with anxiety and concentration. They may have been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder or ADHD, in addition to some of the other things that they get diagnosed with. And the thing about this approach is that it works for all of it. We're seeing great improvements in terms of symptom reduction, improvement in cognition, improvement in memory and focus and attention. And then we're often able to start reducing some of their psychotropic medications under my supervision safely. And that actually then helps even more because sometimes the medications, even though they're, can stabilize people, they often have a lot of side effects that are reducing people's functioning. And so when we reduce the medications, we reduce that side effect burden, and people function better.
Well, why are people having mental issues
In the first place?
Metabolism can help?
Yeah. Well, it brings us to this question that, we talked about in the beginning is, are all these mental health issues really metabolic issues of the brain? And there are a lot of researchers in this metabolic psychiatry space who believe that that's true. And I think the jury's still out. There's a lot of evidence, going in that direction, but we haven't done quite enough science to really definitively state that. But there's a lot of evidence showing that when the brain becomes, for example, insulin resistant, that leads to these diagnoses that we discussed, like schizophrenia and bipolar. And if we can reverse that insulin resistance, those conditions are going to get better. We know that all these conditions also have problems with mitochondrial function. The mitochondria, the part of the cell that make energy, and they also do a lot of other things besides that. And when they're not functioning properly, we also develop these mental health conditions. So if we can do behaviors and lifestyle practices that improve mitochondrial health, it makes a huge difference in people's mental health.
Why? Why do you think this happens? Why is what do these problems create mental problems?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the leading idea on that is that the brain is a very energy intensive organ. So it weighs about 2% of the overall weight of the body, and yet it uses anywhere between 20 and 25% of total energy at any one time. So a lot of our metabolic processes and energy are going towards supporting the brain. And so the brain, therefore, is the most sensitive when metabolism is not working well. When the body isn't producing energy efficiently, the mitochondria aren't efficiently producing energy, the brain suffers the most. And so when those neurons that are typically, going to be transmitting information from one neuron to another, that's how our brain, essentially processes information and how it functions. When those neurons don't have enough energy, they stop, transmitting information in the way that they're supposed to. They stop functioning the way they're supposed to. They may become hyperactive and send too many signals, or they may become hypoactive, send too few signals. But it's fundamentally they're failing and not doing what they should be because they're running out of energy. And so if we make sure that they always have enough energy, then the brain will function better and these mental symptoms will diminish.
How do you deal with people, though, that have these, in some cases, severe mental cognitive distortions?
Yeah.
How do they not see you, like, again, to be frank, like, oh, you're trying to poison me, you're trying to kill me, like, this is not going to help. I don't know if you get any of that. Is there
we do.
Is there a survival component to the illness side? Like, do people cling to it somehow, or does the ill side literally tell the person, like, don't listen, they're trying to hurt you?
That does happen. Yeah, that's absolutely right. There's a term it's a long, Greek word that people use called anosognosia, essentially where, someone with the illness can't recognize the symptoms of the illness, that the illness itself prevents you from recognizing that you have the illness. And that's very common. So there are a lot of people with severe mental health conditions who, can't accept or believe that they have a mental health condition at all. But, in those cases, sometimes those people still say, well, yeah, but I want to be able to think clear. I still want to be able to, concentrate better. I want to lose weight. I want to have more energy. And we say, okay, well, if you follow this approach, you're going to feel better in all those ways. And we don't have to argue about, whether they have a delusion or not. It's not necessarily productive to get into an argument about those things. So sometimes we can sort of meet in the middle around common shared goals. And sometimes then the fixation on those beliefs sort of dissolves over time. And we're doing, everything's going better.
What do people say when they come to you? Do they come for help themselves, or does a friend or family member say, like, we're at our wit's end, you got to help them? Like, how do patients come to you, and what are they telling you that's bothering them?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's different. A lot of the people do find us through their family member right now. This field I'm describing, metabolic psychiatry, is sort of having a little bit of a moment on the internet. There's, a number of channels where people are talking about this all the time. There's research that's coming out that people are talking about all the time. And so, families are often desperate in these situations where their family member has this serious illness. They've maybe been hospitalized a number of times. They're not doing well. They're not functioning. They're starting to get worried that maybe their son or daughter daughter is not going to be able to have a job, not going to be able to live independently, never, live the life that they dreamed they would have. And people are, searching for solutions that they're not finding adequate solutions through traditional psychiatry sometimes. And so, the families are often finding us, and sometimes it's a challenge to convince their family member to want to try this. I have to be frank about that. They don't always want to do it, but sometimes they do. And we can't force this on someone. It has to be their choice, but we try to, convince them that this is worth a try, that they're not feeling so well. They're not, doing as well as they would like. And it's worth trying a different approach. And we can often, get people to try it. The way Accord works is we try to sort of immerse people in all of these behaviors all at once, which for some people works really well because they can start feeling better within just a couple of weeks. If someone doesn't want to do all these changes at once, they can try a more gradual approach, and they may not start feeling dramatic differences right away. It may take some number of months to start feeling better, and that may work for different people.
You can say months sometimes?
Well, if they're going to do all the changes all at once, they usually start feeling better quicker. Yeah. At Accord, like I said, we have people make all these changes at once, and they often start feeling some benefits in the first couple of weeks. But to get the full benefit of this approach, it does take some months. And, when we start tapering medications, they may start feeling a little better, but we have to taper medications very slowly because all of these psychotropic medications have withdrawal syndromes as well. And so we have to be careful to reduce medications slowly and carefully and not destabilize someone with a withdrawal syndrome.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Which change do people seem to be the most amenable to in the beginning? I know everyone's different, but there's a commonality there.
I mean, if they're coming to our program, most people just love the food. People think, oh, ketogenic diet, what's that? And, for people who don't know, it's a very high fat, moderate protein, very low carbohydrate diet. So some people think, oh, no, I'm not going to like that. I'm not going to eat my favorite foods. I'm not going to have pizza. I'm not going to have, hamburgers on buns and French fries. And I can't eat the things I like. But we have someone, a chef who's cooking for us, who's really talented and is making absolutely delicious ketogenic food that's very healthy, and people love it. So usually that's pretty easy. If someone's making you delicious food and putting it in front of you, most people find that to be not so bad.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. And she can make different versions of like the foods that people really want. She'll even make ketogenic cookies that are really delicious. And she makes ketogenic pizza, believe it or not, that's really delicious. And so she can make, even, really good desserts, for people that are ketogenic. So, again, not with real sugar, and not with, bad artificial sweeteners. We have a way of doing all this that's very healthy. And so that's usually pretty easy. Sometimes, some people love to exercise and that's easy for them. But I would say the majority of people who've been suffering from one of these serious conditions, they haven't been exercising in recent years. And so getting them back moving their bodies again can be challenging. But we usually have, take people on walks like, 2, 3, 4 times a day to get their bodies moving again, get those joints lubricated. And we have a really great exercise trainer who helps people get back into movement and exercise again. And that's a really important thing. We know that exercise is incredibly powerful for brain health and mental health. The studies are, there's no argument that the studies are very powerfully show that for things like moderate to even, more than moderate depression, exercise can be very powerful on the par with medication, or even better than medication in some studies. It's just getting people to do the exercise that's the hard part. Who's very depressed. That's the trick. And so that's why it's not as widespread in clinical practice. But if you really, work hard and people are voluntarily coming to do this kind of thing, we have a lot of success getting people exercising, and that can work hand in hand with the ketogenic diet to improve metabolic health in the brain and improve all of these mental health symptoms.
And I know everyone's different, but again, on average, so this is all inpatient. So for inpatient scenario, how long does it take where the person achieves enough improvement that they're much easier to work with now, and the family is like, oh, thank God, thank you.
Yeah.
They're not cured, but they're much better.
Yeah. The minimum we have people stay in our program is 4 weeks, because we really think it takes about that long to get that kind of improvement, at least that long. And then some people stay 8 weeks or 12 weeks, depending on the situation. And, depends on the goal for us is to make sure that they can keep going with these behaviors after they leave and when they go home. So they need to be able to, understand what they're doing and how to do it and have enough wherewithal and motivation to be able to keep it going with the supports that they have at home. And we do a lot of family education too, like, teaching the family about this diet and, what the person's going to need to be eating and also how all of this works together, so that they can really support their family member when they come home, because that makes a huge difference.
But how is it the person that's in trouble that's coming to you, or is it the family saying, I mean, how voluntary is this stay? And I would think people are afraid
voluntary.
of it.
Yeah, it's completely voluntary. So like I said, like sometimes the family learns about us first and they try to convince their family member. If the family member is not convinced that they want to do this, then we won't have them come.
Right.
So this is different than an inpatient. We're really not an inpatient unit. The connotation of inpatient in psychiatry is actually a locked unit where someone is there kind of against their will. And that's not at all what we are. We're more considered what's called a residential program, which is voluntary, and we don't have a locked door. People come and go as they please. And we wouldn't have someone come unless they wanted to do this kind of a program. If this wasn't of interest to them and they didn't want to really, try it and have some motivation for it, that we wouldn't have them come. It wouldn't make sense.
What makes someone that's having problems say, you know what, I got to do this, versus them saying, no, I'm fine, leave me alone, you're the problem, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but we definitely see both. Some people really dig in their heels about, look, I don't have the problem. Everyone else just needs to leave me alone. I'm fine. And, people can go on that way for years sometimes, even though they're not doing well. But I think usually on some level, that person knows that they're not quite doing as well as they want. That person is, they may be very isolated. They may not feel capable of doing things that they used to be capable of doing. There's a lot of loneliness and suffering in these serious conditions. And so usually they have some awareness of that.
Oh, Matt, I cut off the last statement. There's a lot of loneliness. What?
Yeah, no, I think, these people are suffering with these serious conditions. There's a lot of loneliness and suffering that they're experiencing. And they may dig in their heels, like I said, but on some level, I think, they're looking for some way out and so our job as the supportive people, whether we're the, mental health clinicians or the family, is to try to help them, be ready to help themselves. And that's a really hard thing to do. Sometimes it takes a lot of patience and a lot of empathy. And sometimes, we can't get there, but that's what we can try to do is, allow them a way forward somehow. Like I said before, sometimes with this approach, we're looking for some common ground. What are they looking to feel different? Sometimes it may be that they just say, look, I just wish I could have just a little more concentration. I used to be able to read. I can't read very well. Otherwise, I'm fine. I don't want anything else. I don't want these medications, or, I don't think I have any kind of delusions like that. All that stuff is real. But, if I could concentrate a little more, that'd be good. Okay, well, this approach can help you concentrate more. Let's try it. And they may get a whole bunch of other benefits. So, sometimes we have to look for that common ground, common goals. And there's a real art to all of that.
What about memory? I've heard that sometimes when they're mentally distressed, that later on they're feeling better, they don't have memory of when they were in a really bad state. Maybe they said, I don't know, really mean things to their spouse or something, and then they came out of a real depressed episode or manic episode or, whatever it may be. And they, have you found that people literally sometimes don't remember what they said?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a real thing. When people are in a state of any kind of distress or crisis, they may not remember very well what happened during that state. And so we see that all the time. Like if someone has a manic episode with psychosis and then they get treated, whether it's through metabolic treatment or through medication treatment or anything else, and they come out of it, they will often have very scattered, sparse memories of those, weeks or months prior leading up to that. Same with depression. People just really might not remember, what was going on when they were very depressed when they come out of it. And it's not always the case, not universal, but it's very common. people may know too that even, any kind of extreme state, like even, women going through childbirth, often will say they don't really remember the intensity of the experience afterwards. Some do, but many of them will say they don't actually remember a lot of it. And, if you go and get into a car accident, even if you're not unconscious, like you may not remember everything. And then alternatively, sometimes people have, incredibly like vivid memories of every single little thing in an extreme state. And I don't think, at least I don't fully understand that phenomenon, but definitely, altered states will affect one's ability to lay down memories appropriately.
Oh, okay. Well, does anyone know why?
It's a good question. I'm not a expert on the neuroscience of memory, unfortunately, so I can't really answer that. But my guess is it has to do with all the, there's a lot of things going on during those states that are, very elevated cortisol levels from extreme stress, and that can affect, most likely that's partly what's affecting, the ability to lay down memories. But I'm sure I'm not getting nearly all of that right. Like I said, I'm not an expert on that.
Okay. But all these things improve over just a couple, like a few weeks or let's say a month of treatment at the clinic.
We start to see the improvement. Yeah. And then, like I said, to get the full improvement, it can take a number of months. And what I tell people is that the longer you do this approach, the more improvement you get. So, month 2 is better than month 1, and month 6 is better than month 2, and month 12 is better than month 6 if you keep doing this approach. And there are some people who keep going, for years. They can sometimes come off, I've seen a number of people come off all of their psychiatric medication. And again, I just want to be careful and clear that I don't recommend people take themselves off of their medication on their own. They need to work with a physician to do that safely. But I have seen that successfully happen a number of times. And these are people who were told for years that you'll never come off of psychiatric medication. You'll need these for the rest of your life. And it turns out that may not be always true. And then people can stay on this diet for some years. There even are a few people that I know who have, after a few years being on the diet, they actually have come off the diet and their illness has not come back. But I wouldn't necessarily promise that for adults who've been, suffering for something for a long time. But even the fact that that's possible is astounding. And most, as I was trained, I was trained to think that would not be ever possible in my psychiatric training. And I think most psychiatric training would say the same thing. But now I'm witnessing things that I never knew could happen in my training.
Very interesting. How long have you been doing this metabolic psychiatric work?
I would say officially in my practice about 5.5 years. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, are there people that you just can't help, even if they are trying to help themselves, or is it usually you can help everybody as long as they cooperate?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that everyone who does this approach gets some really significant benefits. Some are more profound than others. Like I said, like the best case scenario is people who stay on it and they love how they feel and they carefully taper off their medications and they're, just feeling great. And then there's other people who we don't get that good of a response. They feel improvements in their energy, improvements in their attention and focus and concentration, some improvement in their mood, but we haven't been able to reduce their psychotic symptoms enough, maybe a little bit, but not completely. They still need to take some medication. And, sometimes it may be that they need more time. They could take a little longer, or we need to keep tweaking the approach. The good thing about it is there's always ways to improve metabolism. And we never sort of say, oh, well, we've done everything we can on metabolism and, it's never going to get better. I think there's always ways to keep improving it.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Any examples that are interesting without giving names? Someone that was like, I don't know, maybe they had multiple personality disorder or something really crazy, and the diet and all that, reversed it.
I don't have any cases of multiple personality disorder. That's a pretty rare condition, as it turns out. But I could tell you about someone who had schizoaffective disorder. So that's an illness where people have manic episodes and depressions and pretty chronic psychosis as well. So things like hearing voices and delusional beliefs. And this person had been in and out of treatment for probably about 7 years, but in the last 3 years had been pretty continuously acutely ill, like really wasn't able to function. outside of a residential program or a really intensive program, and was, hearing voices all the time, but on lots of medication, very high doses of multiple medications, and was having lots of side effects. So very sedated and, really couldn't stay awake for more than about 8 hours a day without, needing to, go back to sleep. So, out of the 24 hours was sleeping more like, 16 out of 24 hours a day from the sedation from these medications. And, after a month, we were able to reduce the medication pretty significantly. The voices were getting less. After 2 months, the voices were getting even less, and we were able to keep going down and we got off of one of the medications. And again, I don't always go down on medication that quickly, but this person, like I said, I think was having so many side effects from too many medications that it made sense to keep going down fairly quickly for this person. Now about 8 months in is on, I would say, 1/5 of the dose of medication that he was on at first, and is back working a part-time job and exercising and enjoying conversations, and is awake 16 hours a day instead of 8 hours a day, and back to hobbies that he used to love. So like a complete and able to have just like really good, conversations, and his sense of humor has come back. So, like an incredible transformation, in a fairly, from my perspective, a fairly short amount of time, given how long this was going on for.
Yeah, no, that's awesome.
Yeah.
What is the other practitioners? Do they poo-poo this? Or they go, "Oh no, you're crazy," and it's just anecdotal, or like what's the response from the psychiatric community to stuff like this?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think it's changing. So a couple of years ago, I would have said, everyone is pretty much looking at us like we are crazy. And to think that a diet can treat a serious mental illness, and that was my first response too, when I first heard about it, 8 or 9 years ago. And there's no way a diet can treat a serious mental illness like this. So that's the initial response, but there've been some pretty interesting studies that have come out. I would say, there's still a lot in the traditional psychiatric community who are waiting for different types of studies to come out, which we call, the randomized controlled clinical trials. And we don't have those published yet. There's a couple that are going to be published in 2026. So that may be a little more convincing for some of the people in the mainstream psychiatric world. Like I said, there's huge enthusiasm amongst the patient and family population about this, because it's offering a different approach that could be, more effective for their family member. So, people are desperate to find something like that. And so there's a lot of enthusiasm about it. And I would say, a little bit of growing interest in the mainstream psychiatry world.
Yeah, that's very good.
Yeah.
So your solution is it only in clinic? Are you able to help people, with telepharmac medicine in other states, or are you only local people that come in?
Well, yeah, we have our best results when people come in.
Right.
But we do have the ability to provide coaching all across the country. And then I'm licensed in a couple of states besides Massachusetts. And so I can do some consults for people who are in California or New York, in addition to Massachusetts. We have a dietitian who works at the program who can also do some consults in some different states. And so for some people who are a little more self-starting, or the family is self-starting and they're motivated and they just need some more information and a little expertise, we can help them remotely. But there's a lot of people where this is pretty daunting to make all these changes, on their own. And they really do benefit from coming into the program.
If someone wasn't able to, again, to come to you, but they wanted help, what would they look for online? What would it be called, what you do? Is it metabolic psychiatry, or is it called something else?
Well, our program is called Accord, as you had mentioned, and the website, is accordmh.com. So people can find us there. And then there are some other resources, online resources where people can find, other practitioners who are around. If people look up Metabolic Mind, that's a really great resource to get a lot of education about this. And there is a directory on there of clinicians. So people can look up, who's available potentially in their area. Who might be able to help them. And there are more and more people who are getting, mental health clinicians, psychiatrists, and nurse practitioners, and dietitians, health coaches, therapists who are getting trained in this kind of approach. So it's, like I said, I think it is really kind of taking off. And, people can see what they can find in their local area.
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay. What's the best place for people to go to get help and to seek you out?
So for me, they can go to the Accord website that I had just mentioned, accordmh.com, or people can find me individually on LinkedIn. I'm not on other social media, but I am on LinkedIn. So if people reach out to me there, they can, I can talk to them there and see if I can point people in the right direction or help people find what they need. And then I had mentioned Metabolic Mind, which is people are interested in this topic that I'm bringing up. There's a ton of resources and videos there that people can watch and learn all about this and learn how to think about maybe implementing this approach in their lives or their family members' lives.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, very good. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and explaining. And yeah, this is a really important topic that touches a lot of people, a lot of families. So I'm glad you came.
Yeah, I'm glad you invited me. Thanks for having me, and glad to be introduced to your audience. Thank you.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.